Question 33 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia in this treatise on the Passions is about the effects of pleasure. St. Thomas Aquinas is spending quite a few questions on this topic of pleasure because it's very important, especially when most of his philosophy and theology is directed towards the acquisition of the good. And so when our whole lives are really spent trying to achieve union with goodness itself, which is God, well, pleasure is going to have a lot to do with it, both intellectual pleasure and also physical pleasure as well. And that's why I think he is particularly interested in this. There's 4 articles that we will be discussing here. The first one says whether expansion is an effect of pleasure. And it's not expansion isn't a word we typically use a lot these days, but I think expansion just would mean that the feeling of good that it goes along with pleasure, the feeling of whether it be intellectual or physical, just expansion. You're expanded, you're widened, you're feeling good, like this lady in the picture right here, jumping for joy. That's at least how I take it. Again, it isn't a term that we use a lot, but St. Thomas Aquinas certainly does. He says breadth is a dimension of bodily magnitude, hence it is not applied to the emotions of the soul, save metaphorically. Now, expansion denotes a kind of movement towards breadth. That's B-R-E-A-D-T-H, breadth. And it belongs to pleasure in respect of these 2 things requisite for pleasure. One of these is on the part of the apprehensive power. Remember, apprehension has to do with knowledge. It's coming to know something, right? Which is cognizant of the conjunction with some suitable good. Okay, so you're aware that you have rested in a suitable good, and that's what pleasure would be. As a result of this apprehension, man perceives that he has attained a certain perfection, which is a magnitude of the spiritual order. Okay, a magnitude of the spiritual order. That would be expansion. And in this respect, man's mind is said to be magnified or expanded by pleasure. So he's pretty much given us a definition of what he means by expansion. The other requisite for pleasure is on the part of the appetitive power, which acquiesces in the pleasurable object and rests therein, offering, as it were, to enfold it within itself. Interesting. Okay, so we're drawn to something either through our sensitive appetite or our intellectual appetite or our will, and then we rest therein. Once we have acquired it, we rest. And this is going to be a comparison in the big picture to beatitude, which is our heavenly reward and union with God. And so I think that's particularly, as I mentioned before, why he's really interested in pleasure, is because pleasure is a foretaste of that sweetness that we will experience, God willing, with God's grace, in heaven one day. All right, and thus man's affection is expanded by pleasure as though it surrendered itself to hold within itself the object of its pleasure. All right, St. Thomas can really be quite poetic sometimes with the way he writes. Article 2 says whether pleasure causes thirst or desire for itself. So once you gain pleasure or you rest in pleasure, does it make you want more? Is it satisfying or is it insatiable? Pleasure can be considered in 2 ways. First, as existing in reality. Secondly, as existing in the memory, which would be something from the past. Again, thirst or desire can be taken in 2 ways. First, properly as denoting a craving for something not possessed. Secondly, in general, as excluding distaste. All right. And so yeah, those are the 2 things that he's going to talk about here. All right, next page. He said, considered as existing in reality, pleasure does not of itself cause thirst or desire for itself, but only accidentally, provided we take thirst or desire as denoting a craving for something not possessed, because pleasure is the emotion of the appetite in respect of something actually present. But it may happen that what is actually present is not perfectly possessed, and this may be on the part of the thing possessed or on the part of the possessor. So what he's going to say is that sometimes we we have a certain degree of pleasure, but we don't have it all, right? I'm going to go ahead and read this. This happens through the things possessed not being simultaneously whole, wherefore one obtains possession of it successively, and while taking pleasure in what one has, one desires to possess the remainder. Okay, so you don't have it all. You have a portion of it, but you still want some more. Augustine says in the Confessions, in this way, nearly all bodily pleasures cause thirst for themselves until they are fully realized. And Augustine, of course, was a person who struggled a lot with the desire for pleasure. On the part of the possessor, this happens when a man possesses a thing which is perfect in itself, yet does not possess it perfectly, but obtains possession of it little by little. Remember, this should make you think about human epistemology, how we learn things and we come to know things little by little, whereas angels have infused knowledge and they know everything at the moment that they need to know at the moment of their creation. Thus, in this life, a faint perception of divine knowledge affords us delight, and delight sets up a thirst or desire for perfect knowledge. Okay, that's the key, is that all these questions about pleasure and joy and delight, it's all a foretaste in Thomas's mind of what we're looking forward to, what we're being directed to, which is ultimately beatitude and union with God. On the other hand, if by thirst or desire we understand the mere intensity of the emotion, that excludes distaste. Thus, more than all other spiritual pleasures cause thirst or desire for themselves, because bodily pleasures become distasteful by reason of their causing an excess in the natural mode of being when they are increased or when they are protracted, as is evident in the case of pleasures of the table. Okay, when you eat and you're full, well, you don't desire it any longer, okay? But obviously, a couple hours later, you're going to desire it again. So he's saying that once that particular need is sated, then you're not going to have that need. Lastly, if we consider pleasure not as existing in reality, but as existing in the memory, thus it has of itself a natural tendency to cause thirst and desire for itself, when, to wit, man returns to that disposition in which he was when he experienced the pleasure in the past. But if he be changed from that disposition, the memory of that pleasure does not give him pleasure, but distaste. For instance, the memory of food in respect of a man who has eaten to repletion. Okay, so you just finished eating a big meal, you're in your car, you're driving home, you have a memory of it, but you're not hungry anymore, right? You've had enough, and so you don't need any more. All right, Article 3 says whether pleasure hinders the use of reason. Okay, I need to send a text for real quickly. Okay, whether pleasure hinders the use of reason. Okay, so people go out and eat, they have a nice meal, and is this going to hinder the use of their reason? And it's an interesting, very practical teaching here, because Thomas says there's a certain pleasure that is taken in the very act of reason, as when one takes pleasure in contemplating or reasoning. So when the pleasure is an intellectual pleasure, he said, obviously that doesn't affect our reason. But on the other hand, bodily pleasures hinder the use of reason in three ways. First, by distracting the reason, because as we have just observed, we attend much to that which pleases us. Now, when the attention is firmly fixed on one thing, it is either weakened in respect of the other things or is entirely withdrawn from them. Okay, so if you're always thinking about bodily pleasures or your next meal or your next nap, well, you're not going to be able to attend to higher things like the spiritual needs. Secondly, by being contrary to reason, because some pleasures, especially those that are in excess, are contrary to the use of reason. Thirdly, by fettering the reason, insofar as bodily pleasure is followed by certain alteration in the body. He uses like over drinking, getting drunk as an example of this, which clearly would fetter the reason to the point of mortal sin even, because you're limiting and minimizing the use of reason because of what you have partaken of the alcohol, right? Article 4, whether pleasure perfects operation. Pleasure perfects operation in two ways. First, as an end, not indeed according to, as an end on account of which a thing is, but according as every good which is added to a thing and completes it can be called its end. That is to say, inasmuch as to this good which is operation there is added another good which is pleasure, denoting the repose of the appetite in a good that is presupposed. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing, but an operation can culminate in pleasure. Pleasure can be the reason why we do an operation in the first place, right? Secondly, as agent, not indeed directly, as the philosopher says, that pleasure perfects operation, not as a physician makes a man healthy, but as health does. Okay, so it's the end result. We go to a physician to be healthy, but the health is what we're seeking, right? And the pleasure is what we're seeking in operations. But it does so indirectly, inasmuch as the agent, through taking pleasure in his action, is more eagerly intent on it and carries it out with great care. And in this sense, it is said in Ethics by Aristotle, pleasures increase their appropriate activities and hinder those that are not appropriate. So I think what he's getting at in this fourth article is just that there's a relationship between our operations, what we do, our actions, and pleasure, because it's really what drives us. We're pretty much similar to irrational creatures, always seeking the next pleasure, seeking the next good thing, whether it be an intellectual pleasure, something apprehended, or something related to the sensitive appetite, like the next meal that we're going to eat, right? All right, well, those are the 4 articles in question 33 of the Summa in Prima Secunda. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you tomorrow. God bless you.